There were other world leaders in the 20th century who changed everything. But no one changed everything as quickly as Mikhail Gorbachev.
We better hang on from them.
He ruled for just 7 years. He was the first and last president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
Больше демократизма, больше организованности и дисциплины.
But in that time, walked the world back from the cliff edge of nuclear war.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together.
He let the hammers have at the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He presided over Eastern Europe, peacefully breaking away from the USSR. At home, a failed coup against him ultimately led to his resignation in '91.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность.
And the ultimate unintentional collapse of the Soviet Union. The red flag lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The man who taught most of us the only two Russian words we'd ever learn died at the age of 91 last night in Moscow. Perestroika, rebuilding, and glasnost, openness. Two words that summoned the genie of reform out of the bottle. The one Vladimir Putin has spent over 20 years stuffing back in. In the West, reaction to his death went like this.
He was a courageous reformer and a statesman who dared many things. We will not forget that Perestroika made it possible to try to establish democracy, and that democracy and freedom became possible in Europe, that Germany could be united, and the Iron Curtain disappeared.
He will be, I think, one of the authors of fantastic change for the better in the world. And what I worry about today is that the current leadership in Moscow is intent on undoing the good that Mikhail Gorbachev did, and is intent on a revanchist attempt, a revenge-driven attempt to recreate that Soviet empire.
Vladimir Putin famously described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Sentiment reflected in reaction on the streets of Moscow today to Gorbachev's death.
We thought he could change the Soviet Union for the better, but it turned out that he broke up the country, which led to wars and civil unrest. That's why I don't have a high opinion of him or his achievements.
I have a negative view of Gorbachev's time in power. He did a lot of damaging things to our country. We are the ones facing the consequences.
The Kremlin's reaction to Gorbachev's death today doing its best to be respectful. Vladimir Putin's press secretary described him as an extraordinary person, but went on to paint him as a romantic, lured into a doomed love affair with what he called the bloodthirsty West. In other words, the Gorbachev story is as much about legacy undone as it is about legacy. Although he supported the annexation of Crimea in 2014, through friends he'd made it clear that Putin's war in Ukraine was a disastrous move. Just hours after the death of the man who did so much to avert nuclear disaster, the world's atomic energy watchdog today finally made it to Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, to assess the prospect of another possible catastrophe in a contested nuclear plant. Perhaps one of the most telling reactions to news of Gorbachev's death came from inside a Russian prison cell today, from opposition leader Alexei Navalny. He reflected on Gorbachev's record of releasing political prisoners and Putin's record of doing the opposite to him. On Twitter, Team Navalny wrote, "My attitude towards Gorbachev evolved from savage irritation, he was standing in the way of the radical Democrats I adored, to sad respect." He went on to say, it turned out that those radical Democrats were mostly thieves and hypocrites. Gorbachev remained one of the very few who did not use power and opportunities for personal gain and enrichment. The Kremlin has so far been unable to say whether he'll receive a state funeral or not. which speaks volumes about his perceived legacy in contemporary Russia. A country he tried, but ultimately failed to transform.
Well, in a political career spanning 3 decades, Mikhail Kasyanov witnessed Gorbachev's reforms firsthand, first in Boris Yeltsin's government, then succeeding Vladimir Putin as prime minister during his first term as president. He's now an ardent critic of the current regime, and when I spoke to him earlier, he told me they have undone much of the progress Gorbachev made towards a democratic Russia. But first, I asked him about the legacy that remains.
No, first of all, I'd like to emphasize that Mr. Gorbachev is a global figure, global personality, and in fact, a good man. And he gave a chance for millions of people of Soviet Union, people of Eastern and Central Europe, to build up their life. Just he destroyed totalitarian Soviet Union and totalitarian Soviet Empire and influence on Eastern and Central Europe, destroyed the Iron Curtain, stopped the Cold War, and gave a chance to Russians to build up their country themselves.
Do you remember him coming to power in 1985? Do you remember Glasnost and Perestroika and how you felt about it then?
Yeah, I remember I worked in Soviet Union at that time, and I remember just how young people was promoted, and I was among those people who just got a social lift, just growing up and building up their career, just and the I would say spirit of freedom started to appear just in our society.
Did you have any sense of what would happen to the Soviet Union once that process had begun?
Yeah, in fact, I will tell you frankly, I didn't believe that Soviet Union ever could collapse. But when I understand that just the freedom of speech and, as I say, freedom of meetings, etc., and the pressure by the society to authorities could appear and could create such changes, I understand what democracy is about. And Gorbachev was a beginner of this, bringing this flavor, bringing this feeling to Russian people.
Why was he so unpopular then with so many Russians?
He is unpopular right now because of Putin's propaganda, because of the simple reason. Mr. Putin has completely different worldview. And in fact, he believed that Soviet Union should continue to exist.
But isn't it also the case that he was unpopular with many Russians at the time because he had failed to transform ordinary lives?
It was not so easy to do this. Gorbachev tried, as I said, gradually to change, but he didn't know, and many other people around him just didn't know what to do. That's why people were suffering and criticized him. But other people just felt it differently. They understood they could build up their life by themselves. Without Gorbachev reforms, without Gorbachev's perestroika, Russia couldn't emerge as a democratic state, as well as Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries, former republics of Soviet Union, as well as free countries of Eastern and Central Europe.
Do you think he wanted the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the meddling in all of those Warsaw Pact countries, or did it happen by accident?
I think Mr. Gorbachev didn't want the Soviet Union to disappear. He wanted to have changes and to introduce democracy into the Soviet Union.
You've had contact with him once you had become a very senior.
Several times. No, after my resignation, after just when I already left my position as a prime minister, and Mr. Gorbachev was in pension. And I just talked with him just on many those features, discussed many features. Especially, I was interested to know about an enlargement of NATO. And Mr. Gorbachev explained to me in length just that there was no promises given by West not to enlarge NATO. There was a promise not to put troops and arms on the territory of Eastern Germany, but not about enlargement of NATO to other countries. That's why I can confirm just what Mr. Putin is saying right now. That's his personal, Mr. Putin's imagination.
And just finally, I mean, people will often say now that there is no openness, there is no democracy in Russia, and that we are back in a Cold War. Is everything that happened under Gorbachev now being reversed?
I don't think it's right to compare with reverse to Gorbachev. Gorbachev wanted changes, and he did those changes. Russia, with the leadership of Mr. Putin, heading to pre-Gorbachev period of time, like Andropov's time. That is more dangerous, more totalitarian, and that absolutely just closing the whole, I would say, prosperity for Russian people. That Mr. Putin just stolen the freedom from Russian people, their future, their destiny.
Mr. Kasyanov, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, Lord Charles Pole, a former Foreign Affairs advisor to both Margaret Thatcher and John Major, credited Mikhail Gorbachev with opening up dialogue between the USSR and the West, a crucial step in ending the old Cold War. I spoke to him earlier and asked him when he first thought that Thatcher would be able to engage with Mr. Gorbachev.
Well, you know, it was at our very first encounter with him. Margaret Thatcher had been looking for the next generation of Soviet leaders and issued invitations to one or two of the candidates. And Gorbachev was the one who replied and said he would like to come to the UK. So she invited him to come down to Chequers. And when he arrived, it really was a breath of fresh air. I mean, into the Great Hall he came, short and stocky, but bursting with self-confidence, beaming at everyone, chuckling away. This was just a new Soviet man. So we thought, you know, this is hopeful. This could lead to greater things.
It feels very much that he started the thaw.
I mean, he had clearly come determined to make an impression, and a positive impression. And that, of course, helped develop a trust between them. But the main impact of that first encounter was that she decided he was a man she could do business with. That was the famous phrase she used.
Well, when you think that Putin's spokesman said today that Gorbachev was wrong to believe the Cold War would end and usher in what he said he described as a period of eternal romance between a new Soviet Union and the world, the West, what do you think the West could have done better to help build on that legacy that Gorbachev left?
I suspect some more financial support for him as he tried to push through domestic reforms could have been helpful.
And I just wonder, looking at the more recent past, whether there was a moment where Thatcher's successors could have done business, in her words, with Putin, if somehow the terrible bloodshed that we're seeing now in Ukraine could have been averted.
Well, you know, there was a time when we did do business with Putin, the early years of this century, but to go from that and say we were responsible for the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine would be absurd. There was no compulsion on Putin to invade Ukraine.
And just finally, I wonder if there was some moment, some vignette that you witnessed behind the scenes that illustrates to you Gorbachev, the man, sums him up.
Well, I have many memories, some amusing. He always used to tease me by saying, "We know that you were the man who made Margaret Thatcher so difficult." And I always used to say, "Well, Mr. President, for one thing Margaret Thatcher doesn't need is any help in being difficult." But he was also a humane man. I think, indeed, his humanity was one of the great things about him. He really believed it was wrong to use force and violence in Eastern Europe. Displayed this element of humanity in him, which has been so alien in all previous Soviet leaders.
Lord Pole, thank you very much for joining us.